Hello and welcome to our study today in the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm Dale Robbins from the Eubank Church of Christ in Eubank, Kentucky, and today we are in lesson 7, dealing with the 7th chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes, looking at the wisdom that Solomon has shared with us. And I appreciate you joining our class today. We're using Mike Willis's workbook on the study of Ecclesiastes as a guide for our study. If you should need one of those, get in touch with me and I'll be more than happy to send one your way. The 7th chapter of Ecclesiastes is a phenomenal study because it helps us to get a little bit better grip on the concept of human suffering and some of the benefits that can be found in human suffering. One of the biggest arguments that the atheists and the agnostics cling to is the idea that if God is good, why doesn't God give us a perfect world and take away all suffering? Suffering is bad, suffering is painful, and if God is not stopping it, then certainly either he does not exist or he's not a very good God. And we tend to forget that God gave us a perfect world at one point, with no problems, no sin, and no issues. But man chose to open the door to sinful behavior, and as a result of that, suffering has been a part of the human condition ever since. And as we understand this role of suffering, we see how God has taken even the fall of man and the transgressions of man and has been able to use them to improve us, to test us, to help us to grow. And so while the suffering is not pleasant to go through, at the same time, it can be of value. And so our lesson today in chapter 7 from the book of Ecclesiastes is on the value of suffering. When things don't go as we hoped that they would, when our plans are totally upset, and now we are dealing with adversity, what's to be the outcome of that? What is our hope in all of that? Is there any value to be seen in that challenge? In question 1, the author asks, in what respect is the day of death better than the day of birth? Often we are in sorrow because somebody in our family or some acquaintance that we have has passed from this life. And we see that as a hardship, as a point of sorrow. The loneliness factor is there. And so we suffer grief as a result of one's passing. And yet Solomon says, think for a minute. The day of one's death is actually better than the day of one's birth. If we look at verse 1 and 2 of Ecclesiastes 7, he said, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Death marks the end of any human suffering that we've had to go through. All of those days are now behind us. Man's labor, his trouble, his sorrow, all of those things have now run full cycle. Those are over. But his eternal crown of glory is awaiting him. And so he's moving on to a better stage of existence than what he had here. And Solomon's going to go ahead and develop this idea, though as he says here in verse 2, whenever we are faced with our own mortality and we see the surety of death, it has a way of sobering our thinking and helping us to better evaluate the way in which we are living our lives. In question 2, he said, why is it better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, as he said there in verse 2? Well, the house of mourning reminds us of just how temporary life is. It prompts us then to do a little self-reflection and help us to understand that one day that's going to be me if the Lord tarries. And what are people going to say about the life that I've lived? What about the good that I did or the good that I failed to do? Have I made things right with God, and have I lived a righteous life? One day this eventuality is going to be mine. So going to the house of mourning helps the wise to take stock of themselves and to evaluate through some self-reflection maybe some of the things that they need to change or some of the things that they need to improve. In question 3, why is sorrow better than laughter? Now that seems to be the reverse of what we expect. We want life to be fun. We want to be able to laugh. We want to be able to have a good time. But those moments of mirth are very short-lived. Notice what he says in verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. It is in our sorrow that we truly see the things that we need to purge out of our lives, the steps that we need to take to make life better. We really see some needed changes. And so there is a kind of purification of the soul that we go through whenever we are in those moments of sorrow. Whenever Paul was writing to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10, he said, godly sorrow worketh repentance, not to be repented of. In other words, whenever we really understand the fault that is ours, the changes that we need to make, when we suffer remorse and sorrow over mistakes that we've made, we then learn not to do those things again. We've come out of those moments of sorrow a much better person, much in tune with what God wants us to be. We can repent and do better as a result of that sorrowful experience that we went through. But on the other hand, the fool just wants to laugh. Everything's a joke. We'll laugh it off. We won't take it seriously. It's just one of those things, And so we fail to do that self-reflection that's necessary. And as a result, there's no thought for tomorrow. There's no benefit that we see coming from this. In verse 4, Solomon says, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. That was kind of the problem that the rich fool had in the parable that Jesus taught us in Luke chapter 12 and verse 20. He had all these goods, and he could have done marvelous things with what he had. He could have given to the poor. He could have done other good works. But instead, he just says, soul, take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. We're just going to have a good old time. And the Lord calls him a fool because he did not see how he'd been blessed of God. He gave God no credit for the wealth that he had accumulated, and he saw no guidance from God as to how to rightly distribute that wealth and do good for other people with the blessings he'd been given. And so now he's going to die. And he dies, and all that wealth is left behind. So what foolish choices he made accomplished for him nothing. Yes, he had wealth, but now somebody else was going to use it. Somebody else was going to have charge of it. And we noticed Solomon talking about that in chapter 6 as we studied that last week. In question 4, why is the rebuke of the wise better for man than the song of fools? And he uses verse 5 as his text. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. The rebuke from a wise man has an impact, and it is something of lasting value. We understand this person knows what he's talking about. He is looked at as wise because of his history of making good choices, of the way in which he has demonstrated wisdom in his way of living. And so he is someone that we can look to as a mentor and guide. And whenever he rebukes us and wants us to change our course and gives us some words of advice that could be helpful to us, then that advice is what should be well taken, and it can be of lasting value. It may steer us away from some tremendous mistakes that we were about to make. So the counsel, or the sort of the rebuke, it says here, the rebuke that we get from the wise is so much better than that advice or what we're going to hear from the song of fools, those who just babble along. And that's what he addresses in question 5. In what way is crackling of thorns under a pot like the laughter of fools? That's what he uses in verse 6. He says, for as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. I don't know whether you've ever had any experience in burning maybe a pine branch or a pile of thorns. I just about one time set the house on fire. I thought I'd dispose of a Christmas tree by burning it in the fireplace. And I was young and inexperienced, and I didn't realize what a flash fire all of that could cause. Fortunately, there was not a bad outcome to that, but it certainly taught me a lesson that that flash fire is of short duration and is of very little value and is totally unmanageable. Well, that's what he talks about here. Thorns will make a flash fire, and it's going to burn out quickly. And the merriment of fools is very short lived. You have a good laugh, and then you go on. There's no lasting benefit, there's no continual uplift, there's no lasting satisfaction. It is but for a fleeting moment. You know, the humor passes very, very quickly, but the rebuke of the wise man penetrates the heart, and it's something that can change our character. So the rebuke from the fool is, or from the wise man, is of value, but the laughter of fools is simply a foolish dismissal of things that should be considered and seriously affected in our lives. In question 6, what impact does bribery have on a man? As according to verse 7, and would any other sin have this same impact? Well, let's look at verse 7. It says, better is the end of a thing, that's verse 8. Verse 7, surely opposition maketh a wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart. What he's talking about here is that to a wise man, he is going to be upset when he sees oppression and when he sees injustice, when he sees things not going in a fair and just manner. But then he goes on to talk about individuals who are often responsible for that oppression, and those are individuals who are very prone to reach out and expect some bribe to be given unto them. And in the English Standard Version, it says a bribe corrupts the heart in the latter part of that verse. Remember how long the Apostle Paul was kept in prison because the Roman official was wanting to get money from him, was wanting to get a bribe from him in order to give him his release? Justice is often thrown aside as people are moved by bribes with their greed for money. So whenever you look at this sin, it can trigger many other things. The taking of the bribe shows the greediness and the covetousness of heart. It shows that we have very little scruple in terms of a standard of right and wrong, because we're willing to pervert judgment and do evil to others and mistreat our neighbor because we want to get some financial gain from it. So bribery is simply a doorway that leads us to all other kinds of sin, as we're demonstrating here our love of money. And Paul told Timothy that the love of money is the root of all evil. So many other things come to the individual it comes from the individual who is willing to accept bribes and thus pervert judgment. In question 7, why is the end of a matter better than the beginning? Let's look at verse 8. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Well, at the end of some kind of ordeal, one has already now gone through the test. He's gone through the trial. He has weathered the storm. And as a result of his now being through that adversity, he's had a chance to grow in his wisdom, knowledge, and patience. In James chapter 1 and verse 3, James tells us it's the trying of our faith that worketh patience. And so when we go through suffering and trial, we come out the other side a bit of a better person. That's why, as Solomon here is talking about the benefits of our struggles, he said, patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. The proud in spirit doesn't learn anything from the suffering that he went through. He endured, he grumbled all the way through it, and stomps away angry because it was an inconvenience for him. But the patient in spirit is the one who sees the hand of God in helping him through his hardship. He grows in his patience, he grows in his knowledge and wisdom as a result of the assistance God gave him in helping him through his adversity. So the end of the matter, whenever that hill is being climbed and now we're on the other side, the end of the matter is far better than the beginning, because the lessons have been learned that can be used in the future. In question 8, what sins might anger in the midst of suffering cause? And that's sometimes the stage that sets in with our suffering and our anger, our suffering and hardship, is that we become angry and strike out at everything around us. In verse 9, it says, be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, For anger resteth in the bosom of fools. A quick temper and instant anger can become a defense for some to minimize their personal responsibility and as a way of closing any reasonable discussion as they aggressively assault or strike out at their adversary who may have simply pointed out their flaw. There are some individuals who are very quick to go to anger. They're going to strike out toward others. They are angry because somebody has not given them what they wanted. They are angry that they are suffering hardship. Maybe they've gotten sick or they've gotten hurt, and instead of appreciating the helping hands to help them get better, they're angry and striking out even at their caregivers because of what an adversity they're facing and how angry this makes them that things have changed and their will is being thwarted. They're not getting to do what they want to do, and they resort to anger. As a result of this anger that arises from this mishandling of suffering, you find violence, you find harsh and improper language, you see the mistreatment of others. Often the individual who is suffering and then is consumed in anger is a very poor patient. They do not appreciate the helping hands that are trying to help them get better. And they may just simply dismiss this whole issue. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to take the medicine. They don't want to get the diagnosis. They don't want to find the solution to their suffering. They're just mad. And they seal themselves off from anything that could help them to get better. Anger rests in the heart of fools. From individuals who really and truly don't want to find the beneficial silver lining in the cloud and find a way to learn from their hardship. They're just angry at what they are going through. In my years of teaching school, I saw many a young person who had all kinds of problems in life. Maybe they came from a bad home situation. Maybe they had other adversities that they were fighting with in their life. And maybe they had been uprooted from their homes and were now in foster care or whatever. And because of that suffering, that disappointment, that turmoil in their lives, they turn to anger. And as a result, they become a handful in terms of all sorts of behavior issues as they strike out at the others who are trying to help them. They're not happy that foster parents are trying to give them a roof over their head and teach them some things and help them in their time of adversity. They're just mad. They're angry that their real mom and dad are not living up to their expectations that God would have placed on them. And so anger just flows everywhere. Misbehavior spills out everywhere. Yes, anger can get the upper hand. And as a result of that, it takes lodging in the heart of fools, of those who are not going to see that God's trying to help. Benefits are to be found in this suffering. Now, what can you learn from this? We find in question 9, the author asks, why is comparing former days with these days foolish? There are some folks who simply can't resist comparing today to the good old days. Let's look at verse 10. Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. Some people constantly are talking about the dire situation of our nation, how terrible the sin is that is around us. But back in the good old days, we didn't have this problem or we didn't have that problem. No, we had a whole different set, didn't we? You know, whenever we look back to the good old days, we tend to look back at them through rose-colored glasses. We look back at the high points that we want to remember, but we also tend to forget the suffering and hardship that existed even back then. Our review of days past is not accurate. You know, the best days may be ahead of us. So it's folly for us to look back and just mourn about the fact that the past was so much better than the present. Maybe the present is just setting the stage for the opening of greater new doors that can take us to even greater heights of glory. We've got to learn to find the silver lining in our sufferings and grow. Not to simply say, well, back in the day we didn't have this, back in the day, and look back to those old days. We've got to live in the here and now. And how can we benefit from the time that we are in right now with its pluses and with its minuses? And question 10, what advantage does wisdom give one during suffering? And he mentions verses 11 and 12. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense. But the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. The point that Solomon's making here is that wisdom provides a protection in helping us deal with the sufferings that we are enduring. As we suffer, we look for solutions. We look for the help of God. We do some self-reflection as to what we can do to make this a better situation, to have a better outcome. We have a whole different perspective on our suffering if we are wise enough to utilize the tools of help that are there. It is our defense that helps us from becoming overwhelmed with how bad this is, what the terrible outcome might be, and oh, what if this, and oh, what if that. Wisdom helps us to put those unfounded fears away, for us to realize sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, as the Lord said, and I'm going to deal with today. I will make it the best day that I can make it, and I will work my way through this hardship and this suffering, for this too shall pass. And so we develop through wisdom strategies for dealing with our sufferings. So wisdom is the key. Just as if someone was having financial problems, money might be the solution that could help them through that and help them get things set aright again, if they have the wisdom to use the money correctly and not blow it foolishly. So it's important that we look and understand to the way in which God has equipped us to deal with the sufferings that we have to face. In question 11, it says, what two things are listed as defenses to man in verse 12, and how is each a defense? In verse 12, he says, for wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense. But the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. Well, wisdom provides protection, just as money can protect us from want. Wisdom helps us to work our way through our hardships and suffering. Money is a protection to help us against want and that kind of adversity. And knowledge and wisdom can protect the heart from despair and discouragement. We have the wisdom and the knowledge to know that God cares. We have the wisdom and knowledge to know that God's going to support us and see us through this adversity. So wisdom and knowledge is a defense to help us with our sufferings, just as money can protect us from want and help us through that kind of suffering. Both of them are understandable terms, and so he uses the money to relate back to us in terms that we can understand more clearly, how that there are defenses and there are solutions as we work our way through those hard times. So we find that in question 12, what truth is taught in verse 13? It says, consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? The whole point is you can't fix God. We do not have the wisdom and the knowledge to handle all of those things. Over in the very first chapter of Ecclesiastes, Solomon said, going down to verses 14 and 15, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. We have to remember, as Paul taught us over in Romans chapter 9, that we're the clay, and God is the potter. We can't fix God. We can't tell him how all of this is supposed to work out. We may share with him the thoughts and intents of our heart and how we would like to see things resolved, but we also add in the condition if it's in accord with your will. Because God sees the bigger picture and he knows what's going to be the best result in the end. In Romans chapter 9, verses 20 and 21, Paul says, Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel to honor and another to dishonor, the potter can take that lump of clay and he works it and he works it and he works it, and maybe just as he's about to finish that piece, he will find a flaw. There's an air bubble, there's a narrow place, a thin spot, and it's not going to be the finished vessel that it was designed to be. So he simply trashes it and starts over again, working with the same lump of clay. But he beats it, he works it out, he refashions it, and eventually he gets it to the pristine condition that he wanted it to be in. God's the potter, we're the clay. We can't fix God. So it is not for us to challenge God and to say, why are you putting me through all of this? It's the work of God, and we can't fix some things, but God can, and we have to give him credit for that. In question 13, who is responsible for days of prosperity and days of adversity? Well, let's look at verse 14. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider. God also has set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. God uses both prosperity and the days of adversity for us. He sets us up so that we are going to learn from both of these things. God gives us both, and so we can rejoice in his bountiful blessings and learn from the days of adversity. Over in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 6 and 7, the Hebrew writer helps us understand that God will sometimes chastise to help us understand the folly of our ways and to help us to improve. And so what we're looking at here is that indeed there can be some adversity in that. The suffering is not pleasant to endure, but nonetheless it's there. And so we've got to learn to work through that and learn to understand that God uses all kinds of tools to help us be what we need to be. In question 14, in view of this, what is one's obligation in facing these days? In verse 14, in the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider. God's in control. We cannot control or know the future. And so our job is to live each day and handle each moment. Rejoice in the moments of reprieve and joy and blessing that God gives us, but then reflect and trust in God as we deal with those days of adversity. God knows what's coming. God knows what we need, and God will give us the blessings that we desire. Then in question 15, what benefit do the days of adversity give to man? Well, adversity helps us remember who is in control and nurtures a greater dependence upon God. He is the one, as he says here in the latter part of this 14th verse, God also has set the one against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. God is our solution. It's not in man that walks to direct his own steps, the prophet said. In question 16, what vanity is described in verse 15? All things that I have seen in the days of my vanity, there is a just man that perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. He says that there are some things in life that are just vanity and vexation of spirit. It's hard to understand, sometimes hard to accept. And one of those concepts is that the righteous man may be doing everything right, but he dies early in his righteousness. And in some respects, we may think, well, that's a short-lived life. He could have done so much more good. But God was ready to take him at the pinnacle of his success when he was practicing righteousness to take him home to a better life. So in that regard, his short-lived days here may appear to the casual observer to be vanity and worthless, but it really took him to a better reward. And but in kind of a contrast to that, we as human beings look at the wicked individual and say, well, why didn't God take him? Because here he's living long days in his wickedness and doing one bad thing after another. Well, God will judge him for all the wickedness that he's done. And maybe God is using him as an instrument to help some other people in their suffering reflect and depend more upon God. We don't know all the intrigue and all the intricate mysteries that go into all of this. But sometimes we are prone to think that if we're righteous and good, we should automatically have a long life. If someone is wicked and bad, God should zap them pretty quickly and get them out of here. And God works in much more majestic ways than that to help us understand the fullness of His love, His patience, and His mercy. In question 17, what admonition is given based on this circumstance? In verse 16, it says, "Be not righteous overmuch, neither make thyself overwise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself?" Here we see that the Bible teaches us in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 25 that we are to be temperate in all things. And if we back up to verse 15, Solomon said, "All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perishes in his righteousness. There is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. But be not righteous overmuch, neither make thyself overwise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself?" The overly righteous, who are picky and petty over every little thing, can set impossible standards for themselves and for everyone else, and hence breed discouragement, despair, and suffering. They mean well, they think they're doing right, but they have started splitting hairs, as the old expression goes, straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. And as a result of being overly righteous, they set standards and boundaries that nobody can live up to, themselves included. But then he also goes on to talk about the individual who thinks he's too smart. He has answers to everything, and he has given himself over to wisdom, and he just knows everything. He says, well, why do you think that you know it all when in reality you don't? Over in the first chapter of Ecclesiastes in verse 18, remember Solomon saying, "For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth in knowledge increaseth sorrow." We can wind up putting ourselves in a position of where we are pushing so hard to get that extra degree and to have all this knowledge that we lose all common sense. We're not able to even carry on a conversation with somebody else because of our thirsting for knowledge and how high we wanted to get. We put ourselves on a plateau where nobody else could reach us and we couldn't relate to anybody else. So Solomon said, be temperate in all things. Don't think that you have to set the bar so high in areas of spirituality or in earthly wisdom so that you make your life absolutely miserable. Now, this is not giving license to say that it's all right to have no regard for wisdom or no regard for righteousness. He's simply saying don't be obsessive about it. In question 18, he says, why is wisdom needed in dealing with the words of others? A lot of times folks are going to say things, and all men are going to say the wrong things. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, we're reminded that all men sin and come short of the glory of God. There are going to be people who say things about us that are unfair and not right. There are things that if we find out about them, it would hurt us tremendously. Down in verse 20, it says, "For there is not a just man upon the earth that doeth good, and sinneth not." So everybody is going to have those days when they say the wrong things. And so we can hear too much, and it affects our judgment. And as a result, our attitude towards someone may be poisoned forever. But remember, all have said things that are inappropriate, ourselves included. And so here we're finding out from Solomon that there's some wisdom in our being able to manage the things that we hear said. Let's look at the whole passage here in verses 19 through 22. "Wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. For there is not a just man upon the earth that doeth good and sinneth not. Also take no heed unto all words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou thyself likewise hath cursed others." So we have to be forgiving of people sometimes when they are in a bad mood or are misinformed and moving on wrong information. They may say and do some things that are not appropriate. And we've got to give them some space in that. As we used to say, consider the source. They were just maybe having a bad day. Pray for them and let it slide. Looking on here in this passage in verses, we've listed the question in question 19 is, how widespread does Solomon say this sin is? Well, he said, there's not a just man upon the earth that doeth good and sinneth not. And going down to verse 27, he says, behold, this I have found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account, which yet my soul seeketh, but I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man uprightly, but they have sought out many inventions. Everyone sins and makes mistakes. Everyone goes through suffering to purge themselves from that, to make them reflect upon that and maybe see a better way. And in question 20, what danger is described in verse 26? He says, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands are bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. And he says here there's something more bitter than death. And that's getting tangled up with a woman whose heart is just snares and nets. Her hands are fetters, the English Standard Version says. He says sinners are taken in by those conniving people who are looking to see you be done in, harmed and in some way impaired. There's some folks we just need to stay away from. And Solomon is making that point, that there is a danger there of our being ensnared by those individuals who have not the wisdom of God, and they are out instead to seek whom they can destroy, because, as he says here, they have sought out many inventions. Hurriedly looking at the end of this lesson, there's a true-false section. Man frequently has the tendency to remember only the pleasant things of the past, i.e. the good old days. Well, that's true. And that's what he said in verse 10. A little wickedness never hurt anybody, as long as one does not become overly wicked. That's false. Over in 1 John chapter 1, we find that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. And our commission is to walk in the light, not have any kind of tolerance for sin. We are to avoid it. In question 3, when a man suffers, it is divine proof that he has personally sinned in some way. Well, no, not necessarily. That was the accusation that was thrown at Job, but with all the suffering that he went through. In James chapter 1 and verse 3, it's the trying of our faith that worketh patience. That suffering may help us to grow, not as something visited upon us because of iniquity. In question 4, Solomon teaches that one should go around with a sad countenance because laughter is for fools. No, he said to enjoy that moment. That there are those moments, he said, in the day of thy prosperity, be joyful. It's okay to have those moments of joy and to have those moments of self-satisfaction. In chapter 5 and verse 18, behold, that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat and to drink, and to enjoy the good of all of his labors that he hath taken under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him. It is his portion. And then question 5, sin is so widespread because men inherit it from their parents. That also is false. In Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 20, the prophet says, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. And it's not going to be because of somebody else, our parents or others. It's because we are accountable for our actions. In question 1 of the fill in the blank, the end of all men is death, according to verses 1 and 2. In question 2, it is the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit, according to verse 8. In question 3, anger rests in the bosom of fools. That statement is taken from verse 9. In question 4, the superiority of wisdom over wealth is that wisdom gives life, according to verse 12. And then finally, the last one, there can be benefit in both prosperity and adversity, we are taught in verse 14. Well, there's a lot in this 7th chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. It's helped us to understand that suffering fulfills a purpose. It has a place, and God uses it so that we can benefit from going through it. Man brought suffering into the world through sin, but God has used adversity, sin, and suffering to teach lessons and to help us bring us to repentance, to have godly sorrow that will help us to reform our ways and walk closer with Him. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the study today, and we'll look forward to being with you next week as we continue our study in the book of Ecclesiastes.